Chapter 22. As I came to understand what Manzanar had meant, it gradually filled me with shame for being a person guilty of something enormous enough to deserve that kind of treatment. In order to please my accusers, I tried for the first few years after our release to become someone acceptable. I both succeeded and failed. By the age of 17, I knew that making it in the terms I had tried to adapt was not only unlikely, but false and empty, no more authentic for me than trying to emulate my great aunt Toya. I needed some grounding of my own, such as Woody had found when he went to commune with her and with our ancestors in Kiki. It took me another 20 years to accumulate the confidence to deal with what the equivalent experience would have been for me. It's outside the scope of this book to recount all that happened in the intern. Sufficient to say, I was the first member of our family to finish college and the first to marry out of my race. My husband and I began to raise our family, and as I sought for ways to live agreeably in an Anglo-American society, my memories of Manzanar for many years lived far below the surface. When we finally started to talk about making a trip to visit the ruins of the camp, something would inevitably get in the way of our plans. Mainly, my own doubts, my fears. I half suspected that the place did not exist. So few people I met in those years had even heard of it, and those who had knew so little about it. Something I imagined I had made up the whole thing, dreamed it. Even among my brothers and sisters, we seldom discussed the internment. If we spoke of it at all, we joked. When I think about how that secret lived in our lives, I remember the way Kyo and I responded to a little incident soon after we got out of camp. We were sitting on a bus stop bench in Long Beach when an old, emired woman stopped and said, "Why don't you all, you dirty Japs, go back to Japan?" She spit at us and passed on. We said nothing at the time. After she stalked off down the street, we did not look at each other. We sat there for maybe 15 minutes with downcast eyes and finally got up and walked home. We couldn't bear to mention it to anyone in our family. And over the years, we never spoke of this insult. I stayed alive in our separate memories, but it was too painful to call out into the open. In 1966, I met a Caucasian woman who had worked for 1 year as a photographer at Manzanar. I could scarcely speak to her. I desperately wanted to, but all my questions stuck in my throat. This time, it was not the pain of the memory. It was simply her validation that all those things had taken place. Someone outside the close community of Japanese Americans, had actually seen the camp. With its multitude of people and its swarm of buildings on the plains between the mountains, something inside me opened up then. I began to talk about it more and more. In April 1972, 30 years almost a day that we piled our 3 kids into the car and headed out there. From where we live now in California, coast town of Santa Cruz. It's a full day's drive. We drove down 101 to Pasco Robles community over the Hummocky Diblio Range to the Central Valley, skirted Bakersfield, and climbed through Tepache Pass into the desert. At the Mojave, we turned north onto the same road our bus had taken out from Los Angeles in April 1942. It is the back roads to the Sierras, the main route from Southern California to Reno to Lake Tahoe. We joined bikers and backpackers and the skiers heading for Mammoth. The traffic through there is fast. Everyone but the bikers making for the high country. As we sped along wide roads at 60 and 70, with our kids exclaiming at the sights we passed and our car loaded down with camping gear, it seemed even more incredible to me that a place like Manzanar could have been anywhere within reach of such a highway, such a caravan of pleasure-seeking travelers. The bikers peeled off at Red Rock Canyon, a gorgeous plunge of pink cliffs and rusty gulches humping out of the flatlands. After that, it was a lovely desert, but nothing much to stop for. In 100 miles, we passed two oases, the first at Ocala and the second at Lone Pine, a small tree-filled town where a lot of mountain bluffs turn off for the Mountain Whitney portal. A few miles out of Lone Pine, we started looking for another stand of trees, some tall elms, and what remains of those gnarled pear orchards. They were easy to spot. Everything else is sagebrush, tumbleweed, and wind. As its peak in the summer of 42, Manzanar was the biggest city between Reno and Los Angeles, a special kind of Western boom town that sprang from the sand, flourished, had its day, and now has all but disappeared. The barracks are gone, torn down right after the war. The guard towers are gone, and the mess halls and shower rooms, the hospital, the tea gardens, and the white buildings outside the compounds. Even the dust is gone, spreading bush holes in the ground. 30 years earlier, Army bulldozers had scrapped everything clean to start construction. What you see from the road are the two gatehouses, each a small empty pillbox of a building face with flagstone and topped like tiny pagodas with shingles, curved roofs. Further in, you see the elms, most of which were planted by internees. And off to the right is a large green building that was once our high school auditorium, now a maintenance depot for the Los Angeles Power and Water District, who leased the land to the government during the war and still owns it. Past the gatehouse, we turn left, over a cattle guard, and onto a dirt perimeter road that led to the far side of the campsite. About half a mile in, we spotted a white obelisk gleaming in the distance and marking a subtile line where the plains begin gradually to slope upward into an oblong fan that becomes the base of the mountain. It seemed miraculous, as if some block of stone had fallen from the peaks above and landed upright in the brush, chiseled, solitary, 12 feet high. Near a dozen graves were outlined in the sand with small stones, and barbed wire fence surrounded them to keep back the cattle and the tumbleweed. The black Japanese script cut into the white face of the obelisks read simply, "Memorial to the Dead." We were alone out there, too far from the road to hear anything but wind. I thought of Mama, now 70 years gone. Now 7 years gone. For a long time, I stood gazing at the mountain. I couldn't step inside the fence. I believed in ghosts and spirits. I knew I was in the presence of those who had died in Manzanar. I also felt the spiritual presence that always lingered near awesome wonders like Mount Whitney. Then, as if the rising from the ground around us all the valley floor, I began to hear the first whispers, nearly inaudible, from all those thousands who once lived out here, a wide, windy sound of ghosts of that life. As we began to walk, I grew to a murmur, a thin, steady hum. We turned the kids loose, watching them scamper off ahead of us, and we followed what used to be the asphalt road running from the back side of the camp a mile out to the highway. The obelisk, built in 1942, and the gatehouse are all that have survived intact from the internment days. The rest of the place looks devastated by a bombed raid. The old road was disintegrating, split and weed sprung. We poked through the remains of the hospital foundation, undermined by the erosion channels. We found concrete slabs where the latrines and shower rooms once stood. The irrigation ditches, and here and there a small rock arrangement that once decorated many of the entranceways. I found out that even in North Dakota, when Papa and the other ICES men imprisoned there had free time, they would gather small stones from the plains and spend hours sorting through a dry stream bed looking for the veined or polished rocks, and somehow pleased the most. It is so characteristically Japanese, the way lives were made more tolerable by gathering loose desert stones and forming with them something enduringly human. These rock gardens had outlived the barracks and the towers, and would surely outlive the asphalt roads and the rusted pipes and scattered slabs of concrete. Each stone was a mouth, speaking for a family, for some man who had beautified his doorstep. Vegetation got thickest towards the center of the site, where the judo pavilion once stood, and where rows of elms planted as windbreakers had tripled their growth since the 40s. And there we came across the remains of a small park. A stone-lined path ran along the base of the broad mound of dirt about 5 feet high. Stones had been arranged on the mound, and some low trees still shade it and made an arch above the path. For a moment, I was strolling along, finding childish comfort in this incongruous design. But after 10 feet, the path ended in tumbleweed. The trees were dry and stubby, and mound was barren, and my attention was arrested by a water faucet sticking 2 feet out of the sand, like some subterranean periscope. One of these had provided water for each barrack. They stuck up at intervals in each direction, staggerly sharpening the loneliness and desolation, sometimes the only sign of human presence in an acre or two of sand. The mood had shifted. The murmur turned to wind. For a while, I could almost detach myself from the place and its history and take pleasure in its purely as an archaeologist's site. I saw the outlines, pattern the city must have taken. I imagined where the building stood, almost as I once did nosing around old Roman villas in Europe. We saw a low ring of stones built up with cement and wondered who the mason was who knelt there and studied the shape before fitting them together. We moved around the ring a few feet to find out. This was the old flagpole circle, where the stars and stripes were hosted every morning, and the inscription attached across the top would say, built by the Wada and crew, June 10th, 1942 AD. The AD made me shiver. I knew that the man who inscribed it had foreseen these ruins and did not want his masonry identified in the wrong era. His words coming out of the stone became a voice that merged with all the others, not a murmur this time, but low voices muttering and chatting all around me. We were crossing what used to be the fire break, now a sandy field devoid of any growth. The wind was vicious there, with nothing to break it. The voices grew. The fire break was where we had talent shows and dances and outdoor movies in the summer, and where the kids played games. I heard the girls' glee club I used to sing in way off the other side of camp. Their tiny grade school soprano singing Beautiful Dreamer, Wake on to Me. I closed my eyes and I was 10 years old again. Nothing had changed. I heard laughter. It was almost dusk. The wind had dropped and I saw old men squatting in the dirt. Papa and the stones of his cronies, muttering and smoking their cigarettes. In the summertime, they used to burn orange peels under gallon cans, the holes punched in the sides to keep the mosquitoes away. Sometimes they would bring out their boards and play Gor and Hana. The orange peels would smolder in there, and the men would hunker down around the cans and watch the smoke seep out the holes. From the fire break, we cut across towards the first row of pear trees, looking for what might remain of Block 28. There wasn't much to guide us, but the trees themselves and a view. I remembered of the blunt, bulky Inyo Range that bounds the eastern limits of the valley. When we were close enough to smell the trees, we stopped. There was stunted tentacles, tough the way a cactus has to be. The water table in this one area has kept them living through all those years of neglect, and they were ready to bloom at any moment. The heady smell was as odd in the desert setting all the little scrapes of parks had been, as odd yet as familiar. We used to picnic there in bloom times on weekends if we got a windy free day. The wind blew it towards us now, chilled pear nectar, and it blew our kids across around a high stand of brush. They came tumbling across the sand, demanding to know what we were going to do out here. Our twins were 5 years old at the time, a boy and a girl. Our older daughter had just turned 11. She knew about the evacuation, but it would be a few more years before she absorbed this part of the family history. For these three, the site had been like any wreck or ruin. They became explorers, rushed around, hoping the next clump of dusty trees or chunk of wall might reveal the treasure, the trinkets, the exotically rusted hinges. Nothing much had turned up. The shine was wearing off the trip. Their eyes were red and their faces badly chapped. No place for kids. My husband started walking them back to the car. I stayed behind a moment longer, first watching our 11-year-old stride ahead, leading her brother and sister. She had long, dark hair like mine, and then the same age I had been when the camp closed. It was so simple watching her and seeing why everything that had happened to me since we left camp refers back to it in one way or another. At the age, your body is changing, your imagination is galloping, your mind is in the zone between child's vision and adults. Papa's life ended at Manzanar, though we lived for 12 more years after getting out. Though he lived for 12 more years after getting out. Until this trip, I had not been able to admit that my own life really began there. The times I thought I had dreamed it were one way of getting rid of it, part of wanting to lose it, part of what you might call a whole Manzanar mentality I had lived with for 25 years, much more than I remembered place. It had become a state of mind. Now, having seen it, I no longer want to lose it or to have those years erased. Having found it, I could say what you can only say when you've truly come to know a place. Farewell. I had nearly outgrown the shame and the guilt and the sense of unworthiness. This visit, this pilgrimage, made my comprehension finally the trace that remained and would always remain like a needle. The hollow ache I carried during early months of the internment had shrunk over the years to a tiny silver of suspicions about the very person I was. It had grown too small. Sometimes I'd forget I was there. Months might pass before something would remind me. When I first read in the summer of 1972 about the pressure Japanese economy was putting on America's business and how a union in New York City had printed up posters of an American flag with "Made in Japan" written across it. Then the needle began to jab. I heard Mama's soft, weary voice from 1945 saying, "It's all starting over." I knew it wouldn't. Neither would I have been surprised to find the FBI at my door again. I would resist it much more than my parents did. But deep within me, something had been prepared for that. Manzanar would only live in my nervous system, a needle with Mama's voice. A gust of wind rushed through the orchard, bringing ice off the white slopes and more blossom scent. It hurt to inhale deeply. I pulled my coat tight, ready to head for the car's warmth, but also wanting to hold this moment a little bit longer. I might never be back here again. I was poking around brush clumps and foundation chunks, looking for something else. One more sign, anything. I found another collection of stones, off by themselves, but so arranged that they could not have been accidental. Nearby, an edge showed through the sand, and I uncovered a single stepping stone, slightly worn and led nowhere, yet lay as a subtle appendage to the small rock garden. One of these had laid outside our barracks doors, a first step below 3 wooden ones. It could be ours. Perhaps not. Many barracks had such entrances, but this one would serve. I could call it the rock garden Papa put there. Almost the sign I wanted. Not quite enough. There was more to all this than the lonely patience of those gathering stones. They were part of it, but there was something else in the air, a sound, a smell, just a whiff, hanging on the gust from the orchard, or blown down the ghostly alleyway of what used to be the streets we live in. I was hearing Mama's voice once more, but differently, louder now, right in front of me, and I smelled crock burning. That was one of Papa's remedies when her back knotted up. He would take a little coins of cork and place them on the tension nodes and light them, and the cork would burn dark rings into her skin as she hunched on the porch steps, groaning with relief. They were sitting on the steps like that, Mama hunched, Papa tending her blackening rings, one morning a few days before we left camp. Now the smell and those voices in the wind from the orchard brought with them a sign I was waiting for, the image of rekindled wilderness in Papa's eyes. 27 years earlier, I had carried it with me out of camp, only half understanding what it meant. Remembering now, I realized I had never forgotten his final outburst of defiance. But for the first time, I saw it clearly as the gathering desert stones. And when I left today for good, I would carry the image with me again, the rest of my inheritance. It was the day Papa suddenly came back to life and decided to go into Lone Pine and buy a car. Mama had been packing, and that brought the uncertainty of our future to such a sharp point. Her back went into spasm. She didn't want to talk. She wanted to concentrate on the rings of heat. She let Papa rant a long time before she reacted. That's crazy, Kyo, she said. Don't call me crazy. You think I'm going to ride that stinking bus all the way to Los Angeles? It's cheaper than buying a car. Cheaper? What is it worth? To be packed in there like cattle? You call that cheap? We don't have money to buy a car. I know how much money we have. He jumped to his feet then, rushed into the house, came out with his hat on and a shirt half buttoned, and his walking stick, his turtleneck sweater tied around his neck, and took off striding towards the main gate, leaving Mama with her back full of smoking cork, which had done no good at all, since this new move of his merely bunched her muscles up even worse. It was late afternoon when we heard the horn, still blocks away. Without looking out the door, Mama said, "Here he comes." As the honks came closer, we heard another sound, like a boxer working out in a flabby punching bag. Mama moved to the doorway. We all did. Chiez, May, me, in time to see a blue Nash four-door come around the corner. With it, two front tires flat, and Papa sitting up straight and proud behind the wheel, his hat cocked, his free hand punching at the horn. Heads were appearing at doorways, all up and down the street. He stopped in front, racing the engine and grinning while he eyed Mama and fingered the shiny knob dashboard gear shift. On the seat behind his legs, he held a half-empty quart bottle of whiskey. He yelled, "What do you think, little mama?" She didn't answer. He had not been drinking much at all for about 6 months. She stood there waiting to see what he was going to do. He laughed and made the engine roar and demanded to know where all the boys were. He wanted to show those yogis what a real car looks like. Kyo was the only son still in camp, and he had gone off to help someone else load furniture. So Papa announced that he would give all his women a ride. Mama protested. She said he ought to get those tires fixed if we expect to make this car all the way into Los Angeles. Papa roared back at her, louder than the engine, and with such a terrible samurai scowl that we all went leaping and piled into the car. Mama laughed, slamming the door and climbing into the front seat next to him. "You think it's a pretty good car?" he said, pleased by this show of power. Mama said nothing. She sat very stiff, cool, enduring him. Chiez was the plasticator now, leaning forward from the back to pat his shoulder. "It's a fine car, Papa. You watch." He grabbed the gear level and rammed it into low. The Nash leaped, and we were clopping down the street on those two flats and two good tires, with Papa laughing, sipping from the bottle. At the first corner, he said, "You think I can't pick out cars?" Shift, Chiez said. Softly, Chiez said, "You did real good, Papa." He stepped on the gas, hitting maybe 30, swerving crazily. In the back seat, we were all thrown around, flung from door to door like rag dolls, with Mama bouncing in front of us and Papa's hat crunched up against the ceiling. May cried out, "Not so fast, Papa. You're going to wreck your car." "Think the car can't take it?" he yelled back at her. "You watch this." His Glinchy turned ferocious again. He stopped the pedaling, pushed the speedometer up to 35 with his right front tires. He shredded and flopped like a mangled arm. It lashed out, appending the garbage can. I started to cry. Chiaz, her calm shattered, was yelling at him to slow down. Mama was too. And May was screaming. He wouldn't listen and told us to hold on while he swung into the streets and careening past empty barracks where suitcases and duffel bags sat stacked. As we passed people standing by the luggage, Papa swerved from one side to the other, waving. He laughed, growled, made faces. In front of us, a laden family was hiking out towards the main gate. Papa swung wide, honking and waving. Hey, hey, he shouted. They turned to amuse to wave back. Don't miss that bus, he yelled. At the next corner, he spun off into a desert stretch of the barracks. These already looked like the ones we'd first moved into. Sand piled up against foundation blocks and clothing lines empty, all signs and markings gone. It made no difference to Papa that no one was out there to witness his performance. He aimed for tumbleweeds lying in the roadbed and shouted with triumph each time he squashed one. Chiaz and Mama and May had quit trying to control him. I'd stopped crying. We grabbed for handholds, covered our heads, hoping simply to survive until he hit something hard or ran out of gas. We came back to a fire break, and Papa plunged into it, began to cut a twisty path across the empty, shouting, "Hi-yo, hi-yo!" Gagging rang tracks through the dusty sand. The way this fire break lay, there seemed to be nothing in front of us now but sag brush and open country, rising in the distance south of camp to the range of road. Bluff Colors Hills, rumored to be full of rattlesnakes. The few times I'd wished I could walk in one direction for as long as I wanted, the threat of those rattlesnakes deterred me. And now, farther south, beyond the visible barrier, out in the world I scarcely remembered, there loomed the dark, threatening cloud I'd heard grown-ups talk about. The way we seemed to be heading, I should have been frightened into a coma. But for this once, I wasn't. Watching Papa bounce and weave and shout in front of me, I was almost ready to laugh with him. With the first bubbly sense of liberation his defiance craziness had brought along with it, I believed in him completely just then, believed in the fierceness flashing in his wild eyes. Somehow that would get us past whatever waited inside the fearful dark clouds, get us past the heat and the rattlers and a great deal more. At the fence, he had to turn, sending up a white billow of dust. Where the fence met the highway, we concerned again, heading for the bus stop. A crowd waited there, standing idly, sitting around a scattered baggage. They all turned to watch. When they heard us coming, Papa tooted the horn and yelled, "No bus for us! No bus for us!" The young kids were mystified by this and stood open-eyed, watching. Some of the older folks smiled, waving as we hit a chuck hole and bounced. Papa swung left, and we clattered out onto the wide, empty boulevard that ran the length of the camp, back to where our own baggage waited and the final packing.